I'm absolutely delighted to welcome these two wonderful people this morning because... oh, no, I meant Bator. No. Okay, Teresa and I go back a long way, and I can't imagine how long, but anyway. But I'll introduce her later on. But I was so delighted yesterday to see Bator walking in. I was at the point of going to the desk to say, does anyone know where he is? Is he in the air? Is he on the ground? Bator, and I will say this, he's an incredible man who undersells himself, you know. He's clearly a Jesuit. He is president of the Jesuit Conference of Africa and Madagascar. Some of you will know that the Society of Jesus fits into 6 geographical conferences, as we call them. So Bator and I have only known each other for about 16 months now. He is on the advisory committee to the project I work for. And I was delighted so we've been meeting online quite regularly, but I was delighted to be invited to Nairobi last month to speak and share his company. He has done incredible work in the Jesuit Conference of Africa and Madagascar in taking a real lead in safeguarding. It's incredibly impressive, and I want to thank you for that. Thank you. Okay, I will leave the microphone now to Bator to talk about reporting to church authorities. Thank you.
Thank you, Tina, and thanks to the rest of the team, Alexandra, Sylvia, Hans, for making it possible for me to be here today and for this conference, and thanks for all the work that's been done so far. I want to talk about barriers to reporting abuse and identify some lessons for church and society. There's an African proverb which says that a person who has been bitten by a snake is afraid even of a rope. I take a very personal view to the challenge of clerical sexual abuse of people, power, and conscience, and the resultant imperative to make the institution of the church responsible, accountable, and transparent, and the community of the church a safe space for children, young people, and adults at risk. In my presentation on the victim experience of reporting abuse to church authorities and why they delay reporting, I neither intend nor pretend to impersonate the voice of victims of sexual abuse. As I'm sure many of you know, abuse of any kind traumatizes the victim, provokes visceral feelings and emotions, and unless told in the first person, any other account constitutes an approximation of the actual experience. And so we must always proceed with respect and humility, and as Tina would say, remind ourselves that we're standing and walking on sacred ground. And I also believe that the reasons why victims delay reporting cannot be a matter merely for speculation. And so my presentation would draw on experiences that I've either become aware of or have been publicly discussed in the context of protection and safeguarding. And as I said, at all times, it's absolutely imperative that we honor the pain of victims, always seeking to protect them, to grant them the justice that they seek and deserve and are entitled to. So speaking of institutional challenges, I want to begin by recognizing that reporting sexual abuse in the church, however we define church, as well as in society, faces several institutional barriers. And I want to make some considerations that are important but not exhaustive for understanding institutional challenges to victims' experience of reporting and why they delay reporting to church authorities. Now, I speak personally now and say that in many instances, people who habitually exercise authority, governance, and leadership in the church, namely, specifically, priests and bishop, people like myself, form what you might call, I call, a band of comrades. And by default, they act to protect their individual and collective interests, privilege, and reputation in the face of pressure, threat, or opposition. So this unwritten code of mutual protection and self-preservation results in situations where clergy are reluctant to expose the abuses of one of their own, choose to defer their gaze from situations of abuse, or, as has been so repeatedly documented, decide to relocate suspected abusers. Now, notwithstanding the provisions of Vos Estes Lux Mundi, which we are discussing during this conference, this culture that I call a culture of clerical comradeship militates against reporting, not only because of a tendency to dismiss, ignore, dispute, or cover up accounts of abuse, but more critically, because it signals a deterrence to whistleblowers and victims. And as the recent history of clergy sexual abuse shows, outside agencies like courts, independent journalists, and commissions of inquiry have been at the forefront of the commitment to uncover and report cases of abuse, oftentimes to the displeasure of church authorities. This phenomenon of self-protection and cover-up mirrors cultural factors at community level that encourage silence and cover-up. Institutions like families, clans, and religious communities, say in Africa, are often accused of practicing a culture of silence about the abuse that are allegedly committed within them. Although I would add that the practice of maintaining silence on the issue of abuse is not unique to Africa. In particular, also, religious life can be the place where some people experience abuse, especially of power and conscience. And in such instances, the need to preserve the honor, so-called honor of family, communities, and parties involved impedes the exercise of the victim's right to justice. In other words, whether in church or in biological families or in social groupings, institutionalism trumps accountability, human dignity, and pastoral care. The characteristics of this culture of silence, its mode of self-reinforcement, and its practiced efficiency constitutes a formidable barrier to reporting abuse. It is common knowledge that until recently, as was mentioned yesterday in the afternoon, church institutions in several countries did not have the requisite structures, resources, and personnel to respond to the crisis of sexual abuse, including implementing the requisite minimum standards like policies, case management protocols, and training and formation of priests, and handling, hearing, and processing allegations of abuse as mandated by Vos Extes Lux Mundi. Now, such lack of effective mechanisms militates against victims reporting. Non-existent or inefficient case management systems discourage victims and witnesses from reporting abuse. At best, such systems trivialize the experience, but worse, re-traumatize victims who are compelled to relive harrowing details of abuse without adequate psychological care and or pastoral support and accompaniment. Anecdotes abound of victims of sexual assault and violence and abuse being ridiculed and blamed by law enforcement agents for their predicament. And sadly, similar narratives are not unheard of in church communities. As I said, the vulnerability induced by the experience of sexual abuse provokes a variety of emotions and feelings. And yesterday we heard so brilliantly articulated by Ms. Lisa Horder, the phenomenon of accommodation syndrome, child sexual abuse accommodation syndrome. Besides anger, confusion, and resentment, victims are prone to self-blame, shame, guilt for the occurrence of abuse. But perhaps the most potent single deterrent of reporting is fear. You see, in situations where the abuser wields considerable power, commands respect, and enjoy unquestioned influence in the ecclesial institution or community, the fear of retribution or ridicule constrain victims to conceal, repress, recant, endure experiences of abuse. So while the protection of victims is an accepted principle, in reality, it is often non-existent or barely functional in ecclesial communities. Abusers, we now know, have long arms, and their power to threaten or face down victims into silence means that many victims of abuse, of incidents of abuse, will not report. And that again is contrary to the provisions of Vos Extes Lux Mundi. Oftentimes when the crimes of sexual abuse occur, the victim is the only witness. I hesitate to call the perpetrator a witness. If such situations involve a power differential, the responsibility of proving the crime beyond reasonable doubt creates a formidable barrier to victims who may want to come forward with reports. And as we heard yesterday, and this is nothing new, it is not unheard of that victims are disbelieved while abusers have the upper hand in maintaining their credibility and protecting their ill-gotten reputation. And so combined with the tendency for memories of abuse to be suppressed or repressed by victims, the burden of responsibility that lies on victims disadvantages the latter from reporting. I read a comment recently by Clifford Longley which describes the issue at stake here in these words, and I quote, "And while survivors are often describing abuse that happened in the 1970s and the 1980s, they are teaching us a lot about the long-term effect of child abuse, where the psychological damage only fully manifests itself decades afterwards. Immediately after the traumatic events, it may look as if the trauma has been dealt with, leaving no long-term consequences. The mind seems to try to bury it quickly, even brush it off, only to find the struggle to cope with the memories more and more difficult as the years go by. It is like a kind of emotional cancer, slow to develop, mild or even symptomless at first, but ultimately devastating. The trauma was made worse by the failure of authorities, church and civil, and sometimes even by teachers and parents to take complaints seriously and to deal with survivors with empathy and compassion. And so in light, end of quote, in light of the foregoing institutional challenges, besides serving as lessons for church and society, I want to highlight some areas in need of reform in the church in order to improve and enhance processes and cultures of responsibility, accountability, transparency in matters of reporting. My first point in regards to some lessons. Pope Francis has declared, quote, that the crimes of sexual abuse offend our Lord, cause physical, psychological, and spiritual damage to the victims, and harm the community of the faithful, end of quote, as in Vox Estis Lux Mundi. Now, considered as a juridical and an administrative institution, it is clear that the church has been complicit in the sexual abuse by the actions of some people who represent the interests and defend the cause of the institutional church. There are names, faces, and lives of people, members or not, of this community of the faithful who've been harmed by these crimes, as Pope Francis says. And therefore, in the crimes of sexual abuse, the church, you could say, as a whole, as a body, as an administrative institution, is either complicit at best or a perpetrator as worse, because of people who represent this interest. The abuse crisis has revealed disturbing flaws or gaps in the system of clerical governance in this church. So it's clear for me that the church can no longer opt simply to police itself. The church can no longer opt simply to police itself. A church that understands itself as an unjudged arbiter of private and public morality will mimic the authoritarianism and fallacies of social institutions and political systems, while concocting a sophisticated bureaucracy to conceal its failings, resist oversight, and deceive its members. And so in this context of perversive clericalism, it is imperative to find ways of overcoming barriers to reporting the crimes of sexual abuse in the church. And as I said, it is not enough to leave it up to this same church to police itself and the policies it puts in place. And so as a general principle, I am of the opinion that an independent mixed body of people should be created to ensure enforcement of reporting protocols and guidelines, including investigation of accusations and allegations against clergy, religious bishops, or lay church personnel or volunteers. For me, this would imply a radical shift in the ladder of responsibility and compel church leaders not only to answer upwards, say to Rome or to the Vatican, but also more critically downwards to the people of God. The composition of such bodies should be diverse in terms of demographics and areas of expertise. A useful criterion will be the integration of young people and parents, especially women, into decision-making processes, structures, and platforms to create a more cohesive and participatory ecclesiology, recently defined by Pope Francis as synodality. So, an independent and diverse oversight will enhance the capability of the Christian community to create a healthy church where people are held accountable for abuse of people, power, and conscience, as well as negligence and cover-up of abuse. The involvement of lay people, survivors, parents, and subject matter experts would ensure accountability and the protection of victims, survivors, and people at risk in the church that I would say aligns with the Pope's vision of synodality. Young adults, I believe, can take substantial roles in ensuring and monitoring the social responsibility of ecclesial leaders. They can also motivate other young people to renew faith in the community and actually help design and lead programs of interventions, of protection, of care, and safeguarding in the church. Those who have been exposed to the violence and humiliation of abuse deserve a voice and a role in defining the terms of reforms. My second point is to do with women's voices and presence. As I mentioned, an insidious culture of clerical comradeship poses a serious barrier to reporting cases and experiences of abuse. The U.S. theological ethicist James Keenan has proposed what he calls the Gallant Rule. The Gallant Rule. It's named after a woman, Margaret Gallant, who courageously called on church leadership in her diocese to pay attention to and act decisively in instances of sexual abuse. Now, according to this Gallant Rule, in dealing with any instance that concerns abuse, the absence of women should automatically trigger an alert in regard to the motives and intentions of the enclave of male privilege and complicity, self-preservation, and deception that could cause grave harm to other people. Now, Keenan observes that, quote, in the church and in the university, as sexual abuse cases show, there are all male enclaves of power. All male enclaves of power where women are not present. Where women are not present. Such exclusive spaces of single-gendered gatherings and deliberations breed deceit and cover-up. As Margaret Gallant herself demonstrated, while highly placed members of this all-male club culture attain a frightening level of sophistication in committing and covering up heinous crimes of abuse, women take contrary stands. They open our eyes to the culture of abuse that target girls and boys and adults at risk. Their ethical stance sunders the veil of silence that shrouds and protects the sexual perversion and malevolence of the high and mighty in church and society. And so, accordingly, Keenan argues that instances of all-male exercise of power and authority should immediately arouse suspicion, precisely because the absence of women is a deliberate part of the plot to abuse with impunity while hiding behind the wall of perverse clerical male privilege. So Keenan then proposes, and I quote, a fundamental rule that all men should embrace. No meeting of social responsibility should ever be held that does not have the participation of women in it. If women are not present, men should ensure that women participate, even if the one making the complaint has to abdicate his space to accommodate women. End of quote. And this is a rule that I personally absolutely subscribe to, and that I would strongly recommend for all institutions of ecclesial leadership and governance. So this approach calls for vigilance in order to dismantle an abusive culture of ascribed, that is unearned male privilege, that would rather suppress evidence and or reports of abuse in favor of preserving the reputation of the institutional church and its gatekeepers of orthodoxy and clerical privilege. The final point. It contains the imperative of creating safe spaces in the church for victims and survivors to be heard without intimidation, judgment, or stigmatization. Ideally, the church should be a space where all, especially the vulnerable, can feel safe and welcome, where they are free to voice their fears and report any threats to their person and dignity, no matter the provenance. Again, this would align with the vision of Pope Francis when he declares, quote, that the church loves all her children like a loving mother, but cares for all and protects all with a special affection, especially those who are smallest and defenseless. This is the duty that Christ himself entrusted to the entire church as a whole. Aware of this, the church is especially vigilant in protecting children and vulnerable adults, end of quote. Now, for this lofty ideal to become a reality, mechanisms are needed to provide listening with empathy and understanding, to promote trust, accompaniment to ensure healing, and decisive action to guarantee justice. And to wrap this up, I want to say that bold new approaches to policy making, governance, and decision making are needed to overcome barriers to reporting crimes of abuse in the church. And for this reason, gatherings like this matter. Silence and secrecy are neither viable nor tenable options. The church is a weak and sinful community in need of and capable of conversion and ongoing reform, rather than a perfect institution which projects and mimics attitude of power and dominance that merely cover up crimes and failings. By fostering a culture of responsibility, accountability, and transparency, even in the face of moral lapses, especially of its leaders, and the institutional weakness of its structures, the church would open itself to an honest evaluation and appropriate scrutiny, as well as strengthen its ability to listen to, accompany, and heal the wounds of victims and survivors. And I believe that this is not a tall order. This is precisely what the gospel of Jesus Christ asks of us as the people of God. Thank you.